The day after the opening of the Poetry Bookshop in January 1913, Edward Thomas had returned to Steep in Hampshire, where a New Year's greetings card lay in wait. It was an introductory correspondence from a young, naive socialite who would become his confidant. This was Eleanor Fargen, 31 years of age, who had sent him a goodwill message emblazoned with a sailing ship. He took this teasingly as an invitation from her to what he called lessons in navigation at their upcoming social gathering in Broughton Gifford, Wiltshire. It was a coquettish, even flirtatious response from Thomas. Yet, beneath the surface, he yearned for all the navigation he could get. Eleanor was a quiet, shy, bespectacled woman who thought herself unnoticeably plain. By the time she met Thomas, she had already published 2 volumes of poems. It was said of her that when she wrote, she smiled, and it would not be long before she would fall in love with Edward Thomas, the writer and the man. Robert Frost had marked his arrival in England with a pale lyric about the pleasures of experiencing the English maritime. For the breeze was a watery English breeze, always fresh from one of the seas. But it was the need to find a publisher for his existing poems that motivated him more than the new work. Then, in March 1913, his debut, A Boy's Will, was published by David Nutt. Unfortunately, the notices were not what he hoped. One read, "The writer is not afraid to voice the simplest of his thoughts and fancies, though the thought may be feebly or obscurely expressed." Better notices followed, but few seemed to get beneath the skin of the poems, and fewer still were moved to outright praise. That June, the English newspapers carried accounts of renewed troubles in the distant Balkans. With the ink barely dry on the first treaty, a second Balkan War had broken out that would take the death toll to 150,000. But the event seemed a long, long way from England. In 1913, nobody could foresee the distance these sparks would carry. Certainly not Edward Thomas, who at that moment could barely see beyond his writing desk. He had written, rewritten, and typed, In Pursuit of Spring, an account of a bicycle ride from London to the Quantocks, and he might have felt some joy at finishing his most coherent prose book yet, but instead he was exhausted. Helen tried to keep out of his way, but sparked his temper in remarking that he looked tired. "Tired is not what I am," he snapped. "I am sick of the whole of life, of myself chiefly, of you and the children. I despise myself for not putting an end to it." The summer days of 1913 were not happy ones for Robert Frost either, but the sting of those early reviews of A Boy's Will and their charge of simplicity stirred him into outlining a theory of his poetry. He would call it the sound of sense. Simply stated, Frost's belief was this: cadence is a natural part of human speech. It gives the speaking voice its intonation, its modulation, and its rhythm. We use cadence to indicate and understand meaning in a way that goes deeper than the content of individual words, into the arena of moods and atmospheres. So when, in Frost's favorite example, we hear voices behind a closed door, we can broadly make out sense, even if the words themselves are not clear. In this way, a line of verse can communicate tonally as well as through the literal definition of the words. As Frost was soon to discover, Edward Thomas had been thinking along the very same lines. In the summer of 1913, Frost was writing many of his finest poems: Home Burial, Mending Wall, and the masterful Birches. "I'd like to get away from Earth a while, and then come back to it and begin over. May no fate willfully misunderstand me and half grant what I wish and snatch me away not to return. Earth's the right place for love. I don't know where it's likely to go better. I'd like to go by climbing a birch tree and climb black branches up a snow-white trunk toward heaven. till the tree could bear no more, but dipped its top and set me down again. That would be good both going and coming back. One could do worse than be a swinger of birches. In October 1913, Frost and Thomas finally met for the first time at the St. George's Cafe off St. Martin's Lane in London, in a room that mingled the scent of coffee with, as one guest remembered, the reek of 100 pipes. Curiously, nothing at all survives of a meeting that was to mark the beginning of the most important friendship either Frost or Thomas would ever have. A few days later, Eleanor Fargen surprised Thomas with a singularly direct question. "Haven't you ever written poetry, Edward?" Thomas let out a self-deprecating laugh. "Me," he said. "I couldn't write a poem to save my life." In Hampshire that winter, with Edward more or less permanently away, Helen Thomas turned to Eleanor Fargen for companionship. As they sat up late at night, Eleanor unburdened her feelings for Edward. "You know what I feel for him, don't you?" she asked tentatively. "You know that I love him." "Yes, Eleanor, I do." Eleanor delicately offered to withdraw from the Thomases' lives, but Helen would have none of it, for Helen had made a calculation that so long as she retained Edward's fidelity, then she would, she believed, retain him along with it. She felt sure that he would not develop a sexual attraction for Eleanor. These were confusing times for Eleanor Fargen. She had admitted her love to Helen and herself, but she was far from breathing a word of it to Edward. 3 days before Christmas, Thomas and Frost met again at St. George's Cafe. The meeting must have gone well, for Thomas would begin to invite Frost to stay with him at Balham whenever he was in London. Among their conversations that day would have been the news that Frost's friend, Wilfred Gibson, was moving out of the poetry bookshop for a cottage in Gloucestershire. Frost learned with interest of Gibson's new venture. He had never lived in a community of poets, and now the calling seemed irresistible. Later, the poet Jack Haynes gave a collective name to the individuals who gathered in Gloucestershire in the year before the war. Abercrombie, Gibson, Drinkwater, Brooke, Frost, and Thomas, christened the Dimmock Poets after the parish which, for a time in 1914, became a part of each of their lives. Robert Frost moved there soon after his 40th birthday. In his notebooks, Thomas recorded warm days beside the River Leadon. The more they walked, the more their friendship deepened. Frost delighted in his friend's knowledge of wild flowers and bird calls, while Thomas could listen all day to his companions speak about verse. And they found a meeting of minds on their ideas about poetry, on speech rhythms and sound sense, on uncluttered diction, on cadence and the ear. "He is quite the most admirable and lovable man we have ever known," wrote Frost's wife, Eleanor. Consciously or not, Thomas was preparing a run at poetry, and now he put to Frost the most important question he would ever lay before his friend. Could he, Edward Thomas, possibly write poetry? Frost had no doubts. Edward Thomas had about lost patience with the minor poetry it was his business to review. It took me to tell him what his trouble was. He was suffering from a life of subordination to his inferiors. Right at that moment, he was writing as good a poetry as anybody alive, but in prose form. In June 1914, Edward and Helen Thomas set off from Paddington to visit Frost. At 11:44, the train drew up at Oxford. Haymakers toiled beneath the hot sun. It was 80 degrees in the shade. In his notebook, Thomas wrote, "Then we stopped at Addlestrop. Through the willows could be heard a chain of blackbird songs at 12:45, and one thrush, and no man seen, only a hiss of engine letting off steam. Stopping outside Camden by banks of long grass, willow herb and meadowsweet. Extraordinary silence between the two periods of travel. one man clears his throat. A greater rustic silence. Reviews of Frost's collection north of Boston began to appear. Abercrombie was warm, Gibson less so. I am inclined to wonder at times if, in his determination to avoid artifice, Mr. Frost has not discarded too much. Frost feared his literary venture might result in failure, but his fortunes were about to change. This is one of the most revolutionary books of modern times, Edward Thomas declared, but one of the quietest and least aggressive. These poems are revolutionary because they lack the exaggeration of rhetoric, and even at first sight appear to lack the poetic intensity of which rhetoric is an imitation. The meter avoids not only the old-fashioned pomp and sweetness, but the later fashion also of discord and fuss. In fact, the medium is common speech. Frost was delighted. At last he felt understood, endorsed by a man whom other men listened to. He gave me standing as a poet, Frost acknowledged in 1921. He, more than anyone else. On the 3rd of August 1914, Edward and his son Mervyn set off for Gloucestershire by bicycle. They rode northwest, breaking their journey in Wiltshire. Soon after passing Swindon on the 4th of August, the twin brass domes of the hooter at the Great Western Railway's engineering works let out 10 extended bellows that carried for miles. Britain was at war. That month, Frost and Thomas continued their pattern of walking and talking, and as they did so, something seemed to be shifting in Thomas's mind. Thomas jotted in his notebook, "It seems foolish to have loved England up to now without knowing it could perhaps be ravaged, and I could and perhaps would do nothing to prevent it." A new sensibility was emerging. The war was 3 weeks old, and for the first time he was imagining his countrymen abroad, sharing the same moon as he. He had no care for the politics of the conflict, but his mood was troubled by a different kind of awareness. He was weighing the worth of the land beneath his feet and the way of life that it supported. What would he do if called upon to protect it? Would he do anything at all? One morning in late November 1914, Edward Thomas and Robert Frost were strolling in the Gloucestershire woods when they were intercepted by the keeper, a man named Bott, who told the men bluntly to clear out. As a resident of the gallows, Frost believed he was entitled to roam wherever he wished. Sharp words were exchanged. When the poets emerged onto the road, they were challenged once more. Tempers flared, and Bott called Frost a damned cottager before raising his shotgun. Incensed, Frost was on the verge of accosting the man, but hesitated when he saw Thomas back off. Heated words continued to be had, with the adversaries goading and then finally parting. The poets talked heatedly of the incident as they walked. Thomas said that the keeper's aggression was unacceptable and that something should be done. Frost's ire peaked. Something would indeed be done, and done right now. The men turned back, Frost angrily, Thomas hesitantly. But the gamekeeper was no longer on the road. His temper wild, Frost insisted on tracking the man down, which they did, to a small cottage. Frost beat on the door and left the startled keeper in no doubt as to what would befall him were he ever to threaten Frost or his children. What happened next would plague Thomas to his dying day. The keeper, recovering his wits, reached above the door for his 12-bore shotgun and came outside, heading straight for Thomas. Instinctively, Thomas backed off, and the gamekeeper saw the men from his property. Had he acted cowardly? Thomas felt certain of it, and suspected Frost of thinking the same. Not once, but twice, he had failed to hold his ground, while his friend had had no such difficulty. He would relive the moment, again and again. "That's why he went to war," said Frost. The friends parted company, and Thomas returned to Hampshire a troubled man. In the days that immediately followed his visit, he would tackle the task of which Frost thought him wholly capable, if afeared. A movement of gigantic personal significance was underway. Never again would his chronic depression overwhelm him so utterly. Never again would he think of himself as a mere hack. Not a different man, said Eleanor Fargen, but the same man in another key. Edward Thomas was about to become a poet. Early in November 1914, sometime in the weeks before visiting Frost at the gallows, Edward Thomas had called at the White Horse Inn above Wick Green. He liked to sit in the low-ceilinged tap room, writing his notes or listening to the cadence of the conversations in the bar. In May, he had told Frost of the new start he intended to make in his writing, to wring all the necks of my rhetoric, the geese. And on that November day, he echoed that same phrase in a few hasty notes scribbled down in his notebook. I could wring the old girl's neck that put it here, a public house, charcoal burner. Returning to these notes in early December, Thomas did something that he had not systematically attempted in years. He began a poem. I could wring the old thing's neck that put it here, a public house, maybe public for squirrels and such like, and ghosts of charcoal burners or highwaymen. The wild girl laughed. But I loathe it since I came back from Kennington and gave up a good place. The poem had opened with stride, confidence, and a command of tone. Instinctively, it had found its form in variable blank verse in a loose, iambic pentameter. It was an extraordinary first effort, full of character and good phrase, in places soaring with an energy and confidence that showed glimpses of the promise to come. On the 5th of December, he wrote March. Thomas's search for a true spring had been the subject of the prose book he gave to Frost, In Pursuit of Spring, and this poem seemed to reflect Frost's urging for Thomas to revisit those lines of prose. In prose he had written, all the thrushes of England sang at that hour, and against that background of myriads, I heard 2 or 3 singing their frank, clear notes in a mad eagerness to have all done before dark. For already the blackbirds were chinking and shifting places along the hedgerows. And now, in verse, what did the thrushes know? Rain, snow, sleet, hail had kept them quiet as the primroses. They had but an hour to sing. On boughs they sang, on gates, on ground they sang, while they changed perches and while they fought, if they remembered to fight. So earnest were they to pack into that hour their unwilling hoard of song. What did the thrushes know? There, in those 5 words, is a phrasing that is already and entirely Thomas's own. The questioning, doubtful tone, the restless inquiry, the fallibility of a poet's voice, these were already instinctively, distinctively, the voice of Edward Thomas. My works come pouring in on you now, Thomas told Frost on the 15th of December. Tell me all you dare about them. Thomas's industry was frantic, even manic. Poems and letters about poems and replies to those letters about poems. There was little room for family or for worrying about money. The experience was all-consuming. In that first week, Thomas had established most of the themes that would characterize his verse in the 2 years ahead. The rhythms of speech and thought and song, the variable blank verse form, the use of country characters who would conduct his narratives, the spaces in which the human and the natural worlds intersect, the power of memory and of childhood, the hesitation and doubt that he found so disabling in his own life. Few new themes were introduced after that first week. One, however, would arrive in the next few days. It was a feature that had touched his prose and had been guided to the surface by the psychoanalyst Godwin Baines. Now it would feature in his verse. It saw Thomas at his most schizophrenic, at his darkest and most interesting. It was the projection of his alter ego upon his writing. The poem The Other recalls the mysterious figure of the other man who had ridden with Thomas along his trail from London to Somerset in his book In Pursuit of Spring. The forest ended, the poem began, in the most beguiling of the openings that Thomas had found to date. Out into the clearing, the eye emerges and finds before him an inn. There, he is mistaken for another man, a double, who had slept there the night before. The eye is gripped with a sense of fear, and yet, urged on by some unarticulated desire, he chooses to pursue the man in the hope to outrun that other, with no clear notion of what he would do were he to catch him. As December deepened, it became increasingly apparent to the British public that the war would not be over by Christmas. Edward Thomas was no more decided than before about enlistment. As it happened, Thomas ensured that he himself would be incapable of any form of physical defence for some time to come. On the 2nd of January, descending the shoulder of Mutton Hill, he sprained his ankle so severely that he would be unable to put any weight on it for several weeks. The result was a literary dam burst. Confined to the cottage between the 4th and the 23rd of January 1915, Thomas completed 16 poems in 20 days. As Thomas read back through his field notebooks, he came across this entry from his train ride to Dimmock in June 1914. A glorious day. At Oxford, tiers of pure white clouds and gaps of dark clear blue above haymaking and elms. Then we stopped at Addlestrop, the notebook had continued, and quickly it had suggested to Thomas the easy, wistful tone that would become his most loved and best remembered poem. Yes, I remember Addlestrop. The name, because one afternoon of heat, the express train drew up there, unwontedly. It was late June. The steam hissed. Someone cleared his throat. No one left and no one came on the bare platform. What I saw was Addlestrop, only the name, and willows, willow herb and grass, and meadowsweet and haycocks dry, no whit less still and lonely fair than the high cloudlets in the sky. And for that minute a blackbird sang close by, and round him, mistier, farther and farther, all the birds of Oxfordshire and Gloucestershire. Of all the poems that Edward Thomas would leave behind, it is these 16 lines of loose tetrameter that are perhaps hardest to put a finger on. What is it that has gotten so under the skin of readers over the years? Perhaps it is something to do with the lazed, heat-filled atmosphere it evokes of that last summer before the war, or the inscrutable chorus of birdsong into which the poem dissolves. Most probably, it is not the pinpointing of any particular episode or event that stirs this poem to life, but something about the wordlessness of thought and memory, and the notion that the mind can overcome things lost or misplaced to travel across space or time. What one of Thomas's greatest admirers, Ivor Gurney, would call nebulously, intangibly beautiful. It would be published in the New Statesman 3 weeks after Edward Thomas's death. The month's outpouring of poetry had been extraordinary, but Thomas was keenly aware that these verses, however pleasing, were not a source of income. He told John Freeman that he wished to join Robert Frost in America, but wondered where the money might come from. And now he had in his pocket the literature on enlistment. It isn't glory that I want, but just to get rid of the thoughts that I have had since I first felt I ought to do something, though I never felt I could except under what seems a sort of alien compulsion. I hate all crowds, I hate uncertainty, so naturally I hate the idea of being in the army in any capacity. At the beginning of February, Frost's final travel arrangements were falling into place. On the 6th of February 1915, he and his family arrived in Hampshire to say their goodbyes. In Frost's words, "Thomas and I had become so inseparable that we came to be looked on as a sort of literary Siamese twins, with a spiritual bond holding us together." With the Americans' retreat home, that bond would now be tested to the full, in what must have been a private agony for Thomas. Frost had brought him inspiration and humor, kindness and sympathy and understanding. He had listened with patience to his complaints. He had encouraged him in his marriage and guided him in his writing, roughed him up when called upon. And now Thomas would have to face all of this by himself.
Tobias
Zeppelins are coming to London, Edward Thomas wrote to Robert Frost on the 1st of June 1915. The capital had been bombed the night before and was now gripped by the panic buying of gas masks. Everything now was revolving around Thomas's quarrel with himself, whether or not to write poetry, go to America, or enlist. Money was tighter than ever. Even his wife, Helen, teased him about his prevarication. He wrote to Frost, "These last few days I have been looking at two alternatives, trying to enlist or coming out to America. Helen points out that I could try America and then enlist if it failed, but not the other way around." "Frankly, I do not want to go," he confessed, "but hardly a day passes without my thinking I should. With no call, the problem is endless." But the problem was not endless, for a poem of Frost's had arrived which would dramatically force Thomas's hand. The road not taken. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same, and both that morning equally lay, in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day. Yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And that has made all the difference. Noble, charismatic, wise. In the years since its composition, the road not taken has been understood by some as an emblem of individual choice and self-reliance, a moral tale in which the traveler takes responsibility for their own destiny. But it was never intended to be read as such by Frost, who was well aware of the playful ironies contained within it. First, he places a mischievous admission about the wearing of the grass, that along each path the passing there has worn them really about the same. So, when the poem culminates in a claim that he took the path less travelled by, it does so with its tongue in its cheek. But the poem carried a more personal message besides. About a friend who had gone off to war, Frost said later. A person who, whichever road he went, would be sorry he didn't go the other. That person was Edward Thomas. For Thomas, choice was not an act of free will. Instead, some choices are prescribed, compelled, ingrained in circumstance or personality. Some characters are called. He broke the news to Frost. Last week I had screwed myself up to the point of believing I should come out to America and lecture, but I have altered my mind. I am going to enlist, if the doctor will pass me. On the 14th of July, Thomas took his army medical examination. He passed and began the process of letting his friends know. For Eleanor Fargen, he prepared a personal visit, calling at her mother's home. I rose as he came into the room, she wrote. He bent his head, and for the only time in our 4 years of friendship, we kissed spontaneously. He sat down, saying, "Well, I've joined up." But to his wife, Helen, he broke the news by telegram and left her alone in Steep with her despair. No, 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 was all I could say. Not that. On the morning of the 19th of July, Thomas swore his oath and reported for physical drill at Regent's Park. In September, Thomas made the move out to High Beach Camp near Loughton, Essex, on the fringe of Epping Forest. He described the scene to Jack Haynes. "We are in huts, nearly 100 of us in a big corrugated iron room formerly used as Sunday school. Conditions are cramped and not over clean. The food is ill-cooked and ill-served and has to be eaten in haste." A few weeks later, he was asked to report to a new camp called Hare Hall in Romford, Essex. "I wonder, would you recognize me with hair cropped close and carrying a thin little swagger cane," he wrote, adding, "I was never so well or in so balanced a mood." Whatever the reason for Thomas's mood, there may have been one new factor at play that he was largely concealing. In November, Thomas made a social call on a woman he had not seen in more than 15 years. Edna Clark Hall lived only a few miles from Hare Hall Camp and was a poet and painter. She was a year younger than Thomas, beautiful, and a mother of 2. And she was desperately lonely as her husband, a barrister, spent lengthy weeks at his chambers in Gray's Inn. Edna and Edward had first met around the turn of the century, when even then it was apparent to both that her marriage seemed to lack understanding. Thomas used to visit her then in the company of a solicitor friend who would discuss law with William, leaving Edna and Edward to one another's company. "They are there," said Edward flirtatiously, "and we are here." Over the 8 months he was stationed at Hare Hall Camp, Thomas became a frequent caller. The two would walk together in the fields and lanes surrounding the house, gathering fallen wood from the orchard, with which they would feed the open fire as they talked of their arts of poetry and painting. Thomas's gentle understanding of Edna's domestic plight and their rangy artistic conversations and shared interests were a lifeline to Edna that winter of 1915. Throughout her journals, she captured many of his characteristic, gentle touches. There is a smile at the corner of those lips, where pride with tenderness dwell. There is ease in the quiet manner and in the blue of those eyes, like thoughts, shy and perfect as a bird. When the call for officers came in that month, Thomas gave it serious consideration. And coming home from Hare Hall that weekend of the 22nd of January, Thomas put to paper a 64-line poem that he had begun to turn over in his head the week before, and which very clearly now pointed towards the next step in his journey. Now all roads lead to France, and heavy is the tread of the living, but the dead, returning, lightly dance. Whatever the road bring to me or take from me, they keep me company with their pattering, crowding the solitude of the loops over the downs, hushing the roar of towns and their brief multitude. As winter deepened, something began to change in the poetry that Edward Thomas was writing. A string of poems mined, or struggled to mine, the subject of love. No one so much as you loves this my clay, or would lament as you its dying day. You know me through and through, though I have not told, and though with what you know you are not bold. None ever was so fair as I thought you. Not a word can I bear spoken against you. All that I ever did for you seemed coarse compared with what I hid, nor put in force. My eyes scarce dare meet you, lest they should prove I but respond to you, and do not love. We look and understand. We cannot speak, except in trifles and words the most weak. Helen found herself questioning the inspiration behind Edward's new poem. Thomas told her that these were verses to his mother, and it is not beyond possibility that they might have begun that way in the mind of the author, although clay had already become a kind of code word that he shared with Edna Clark Hall. He was at pains to tell Helen that he was incapable of loving. You know my usual belief is that I don't and can't love, and haven't done for something near 20 years. You know, too, that you don't think my nature really compatible with love, being so clear and critical. You know how unlike I am to you, and you know that you love, so how can I? Whatever the provenance of the winter love poems, the quartet of pieces he wrote that spring were very certainly written for his family. He once referred to them as household poems, one for each of his children, and one for Helen. I would give you back yourself, and myself too, if I could find where it lay hidden, and it proved kind. On Easter Sunday, from his hut at Hare Hall, Thomas drafted an identical pair of 12-line lyrics, each of which hinted at the passing of opportunity. Like the touch of rain she was on a man's flesh and hair and eyes, when the joy of walking thus has taken him by surprise. With the love of the storm he burns, he sings, he laughs. Well I know how, but forgets when he returns, as I shall not forget her. Go now. There for a moment the ink of the first draft ended, until Thomas returned later to add in pencil, those two words shut a door between me and the blessed rain that was never shut before and will not open again. In only 2 of Thomas's 142 collected poems do people kiss, here and in The Unknown, written 3 months apart, both in Essex, with Helen away and Edna close by. It is reasonable to suppose both poems are fantasies, projections of ideals and desires. There is little in Edna's journals to expressly suggest that a kiss might have taken place. So intensely does she linger over the minute detail of their glances and touches that an event as noteworthy as this would probably have been written up more than once. The months in Essex have produced 8 or 9 intimate poems. But whoever or whatever had been in his thoughts, these musings would now cease, and his thoughts would turn towards the war
Tomorrow, Edward leaves for the front in the final episode of Now All Roads Lead to France by Matthew Hollis. The reader was Tobias Menzies. It was abridged by Richard Hamilton and produced by Emma Harding.
The war was less than 2 years old, Edward Thomas's own war almost a year, and he began a poem on the 27th of May with the working title of The Last Team. By the time he had finished it, he had taken a step towards his decision to seek a commission on the front line. The poem he wrote may not have been a conventional war poem, but the war touched every part of it. As the team's head brass flashed out on the turn, the lovers disappeared into the wood. I sat among the boughs of the fallen elm that strewed an angle of the fallow, and watched the plough narrowing a yellow square of charlock. Every time the horses turned, instead of treading me down, the ploughman leaned upon the handles to say or ask a word, about the weather, next about the war. Scraping the share, he faced towards the wood and screwed along the furrow till the brass flashed once more. The blizzard felled the elm whose crest I sat in by a woodpecker's round hole, the ploughman said. When will they take it away? When the war's over. So the talk began. 1 minute and an interval of 10. A minute more and the same interval. Have you been out? No. If I could only come back again, I should. I could spare an arm, I shouldn't want to lose a leg. If I should lose my head, why so, I should want nothing more. Have many gone from here? Yes. Many lost? Yes, a good few. Only 2 teams work on the farm this year. One of my mates is dead. The second day in France they killed him. It was back in March. The very night of the blizzard, too. Now, if he had stayed here, we should have moved the tree. And I should not have sat here. Everything would have been different, for it would have been another world. Aye, and a better, though. If we could see all might seem good. Then the lovers came out of the wood again. The horses started, and for the last time I watched the clods crumble and topple over after the ploughshare and the stumbling team. If we could see all, Thomas had written, all might seem good. Here the speaker had understood something invaluable. It realized what was wrong with the scene in which he sat, that the world he enjoyed was contingent upon those who were willing to fight for it. It was somewhere around this time, said Eleanor Fargen, that she pressed Thomas on precisely why he chose to enlist. He was said to pause, bend down to scoop a handful of soil from around his shoe, and say, literally, for this. Within 8 weeks of writing this poem, Thomas had committed himself to service overseas. I offered myself for artillery, and today I was accepted. After months of panic and uncertainty, I feel much happier. On the 20th of October, Thomas sent his wife Helen a set of the verses which he was preparing for publication with Selwyn and Blount. Don't send to Frost before I tell you that the thing is settled, he urged. Frost, meanwhile, had published his 3rd collection, Mountain Interval. It opened with The Road Not Taken, typeset in italics to suggest a governing tone for the book. Thomas was no longer reviewing. His attentions were now almost entirely military. I might very well be in France before Christmas, he wrote to Frost. I hope so. From Trowbridge he wrote, Lights Out, A poem that he said sums up what I have often thought of that call, though no reader could mistake its deeper undercurrent. Here is Helen Thomas in later life reading Lights Out.
I have come to the borders of sleep, the unfathomable deep forest where all must lose their way, however straight or winding, soon or late they cannot choose. There is not any book or face of dearest look that I would not turn from now. To go into the unknown, I must enter and leave alone, I know not how. The tall forest towers, its cloudy foliage lowers ahead, shelf above shelf. Its silence I hear and obey, that I may lose my way and myself.
On the weekend of the 6th and 7th of January 1917, Thomas was at his home at High Beach for the last time before he left for France. Friends arrived to say their goodbyes, Eleanor Fargen among them. At the top of the stairs, Fargen and Thomas kissed goodnight. Strong as it was, she wrote, and for me, so very deep. Our friendship had remained undemonstrative from beginning to end. He read stories to Bronwyn and studied maps with Mervyn and told each of them to be kind to their mother while he was away. But between Edward and Helen, the kindness was not so easily manageable. He was terse as he reminded her about their life assurance and other documents he thought she might one day need, and they bickered about trivialities. The last day he might have had with Helen, he spent in London. He had a dental check and saw some literary friends before returning. With his luggage standing in the hall, the enormity of the situation seemed too much to speak of. He pressed upon her the need, should he not return, for hired help to dig in the potatoes. Helen could no longer rein back her desperation and felt engulfed by an uncontrollable grief. She would recount his tenderness in that moment. He read to her and carried her to the bedroom in his greatcoat. "Helen, Helen," he had said, "remember that whatever happens, all is well between us, forever and ever." When the morning came, she stood at the gate and watched him disappear into the mist and snow. The sorrow of true love is a great sorrow, and true love parting blackens a bright morrow. Yet almost they equal joys, since their despair is but hope blinded by its tears, and clear above the storm, the heavens wait to be seen. The men of 244 Siege Battery rose at 5 o'clock on the 29th of January. By 6:30, they were marching from Codford through the frost, singing "Pack Up Your Troubles" in the darkness. Edward Thomas said to hear the men sing the rotten song with such gusto brought a tear to his eye. The train to Southampton was perishingly cold, but delivered them to the docks by 9:30. It was a tumbling crossing, but the arrival at Le Havre was restful and unforgettable. At sunrise, they marched through fields full of cotton bales and falling snow. They arrived at camp at 9:45 a.m. Thomas wrote to Eleanor Fargen to ask after the progress of his book proofs and to make sure that she had not omitted the dedication to Robert Frost. The battery spent almost a week in Le Havre before moving up to a position near the cathedral town of Arras. Each morning, Thomas's duty was to identify an observation post from which he might survey the German lines. Not a living thing came into view on the first day. Only a snowy, broken land with posts and wires and dead trees. His 39th birthday came and went without any post. Thomas wrote that he no longer wanted anything consciously, except, I suppose, the end. "I should like to be a poet, just as I should like to live. But I know as much about my chances in either case, and I don't really trouble about either. Only, I want to come back more or less complete. No sooner had Thomas mailed this off than another came in the post. Helen had forwarded a letter that she had received from Frost. "I have found a publisher for his poems in America," Frost declared. It was extraordinary news. The poet, who had come so recently to his trade, and who had met with one rejection after another from English editors, was to have his debut published in both Britain and America. "So you did find a publisher after all? I've just heard," Thomas replied. And that was it. No thank you, no euphoria, and only a passing mention in his diary. On Good Friday, Edward Thomas read a review from the TLS of an anthology of new poetry, which carried 18 of Thomas's poems under the name of Edward Easterway. He is a real poet, with the truth in him. Robert Frost said this: "His poetry is so very brave, so unconsciously brave. He didn't think of it for a moment as war poetry, though that is what it is. It ought to be called Roads to France." Saturday, April 7th or 8th. Arras. Dearest, here I am in my valise on the floor of my dugout, writing before sleeping. The artillery is like a stormy tide breaking on the shores of the full moon. I watch the shells changing the landscape. The pretty village among trees that I first saw 2 weeks ago is now just ruins among violated, stark tree trunks. Edward Thomas spent the day before he died under particularly heavy bombardment. The shell that fell 2 yards from where he stood should have killed him, but instead it was a rare dud. Back at billet, the men teased him on his lucky escape. Someone remarked that a fellow with Thomas's luck should be safe wherever he went. The Fanny Thomas was embroidering a wild duck onto a postcard to send to her daddy when the telegraph boy drew up outside the house. Helen read the message in silence while he waited for her reply. "No answer," she eventually said. On the last pages of his war diary, Edward Thomas wrote, "I never understood quite what was meant by God," and in pencil the following 3 lines: "Where any turn may lead to heaven, or any corner may hide hell, roads shining like river uphill after rain." Robert Frost wrote to Helen in condolence, "I want to see him to tell him something. I want to tell him what I think he liked to hear from me, but he was a poet."
Tobias Menzies was reading Now All Roads Lead to France by Matthew Hollis. It was abridged by Richard Hamilton and produced by Emma Harding. Coming up after the news, Jenny Murray is in the presenter's chair for today's edition of Woman's Hour.
What is it?
A boy, your ladyship. Questionably, a boy. An heir.